that John Wesley should write generously of monks or individuals embracing quasi-monastic or hermit life is perhaps at first sight surprising or perplexing. For were not monks viewed generally by the British as Catholic society's parasites, vermin, and potential spearheads against British Protestantism, charges given visual expression by William Hogarth? Did not the free thinker, slide please Daniel, Edward Gibbon deride the sacred indolence of the monks? And Matthew Lewis, in his remarkable Gothic novel, The Monk, 1796, depict monks as potentially depraved and indeed much worse. And was not Wesley an ultra-Protestant who repeatedly denounced Roman Catholicism in print, and who in his, slide please, Popery Calmly Considered of 1779 specifically noted that celibacy was the cause of innumerable mischiefs? Was he, among so many others, not accused of inciting the dreadful anti-Catholic Gordon riots of 1780? And did he not have good reason for strident denunciations of monasticism in the light of allegations that the early Methodists were papists in disguise? Slide please. A claim again depicted by Hogarth. Note there the exposure of the tonsure on the mechanic preacher in the pulpit. And given that Wesley's Oxford Holy Club had appeared so disconcertingly like a disciplined monkish order. Of course, Wesley sometimes attacked monks sharply. In his concise History of England, 1776, he claimed that on the eve of the Reformation, many religious houses were in display of monstrous disorders. Monkish histories were dishonest. King John's opposition to the imperious Innocent III's religious terror prompted the observation that the monks have painted that monarch in the blackest colours in order to excuse the Pope's proceedings against him. But Wesley's mind was not closed. In 1780 to 81, he battled in print with an Irish Capuchin, Arthur O'Leary. But when he met him in 1787, he unexpectedly found him of an easy, genteel carriage, seemingly not wanting either in sense or learning. But more important was the wider context. Popery Calmly Considered contains pertinent, arresting comments. By the tender mercies of God, many members of the Church of Rome have been and are now holy men, notwithstanding their principles. And again, that many members of that church have been holy men, and that many are so now, I firmly believe. Likewise, in his journal, he wrote, "What a multitude of wrong opinions are embraced by all members of the Church of Rome. Yet how highly favoured have many of them been." Wesley, of course, knew of such figures from his early years. When preparing for orders at Oxford in the 1720s, his correspondence with his parents reveal a careful reading of De Imitatione Christi by Thomas à Kempis, a person of great piety and devotion. Above all, Wesley sought a deep, intense spirituality when reading Catholic works of devotion. The religion of the heart, that life of God in the soul of man, the walking with God and having fellowship with the Father and the Son. And might well not monks and hermits exhibit precisely that? There were then Catholics of whom Wesley approved, including post-Reformation Catholics, including Fenelon and Pascal. But, as Eamon Duffy has stressed, two modern Catholics dwarfed all others in Wesley's scheme. Gaston Duranty, 1611 to 49, and before him, Gregorio Lopez, 1542 to 96. Between 1749 and 1755, Wesley published his 50-volume Christian library, slide please, consisting of the choicest pieces of practical divinity. He included the life of Lopez in the collection, slide please. It ended the final volume. Born in Madrid, Lopez, slide please, was briefly a page at Philip II's court. But in 1562, aged 20, he went to New Spain, where, in an isolated spot, he built a small cell and lived a solitary, utterly austere life. He quitted the cell 3 years later, and after much wandering, lived finally at Santa Fe, where he was joined by a disciple, Francisco de Losa, who, after Lopez's death, composed his biography. Lopez never became a monk, but he nearly did so when offered a little cell where he might pass his life in retirement and prayer in the monastery of St. Dominic in Mexico. He accepted, but then became convinced that God wished him to continue living as a hermit, in himself a living temple. And when asked, what would you have done if you had been a priest? He replied, what I do now. The appeal of Lopez for Wesley was the hermit's growing sense of God's presence, charted in de Los's life and achieved through intense meditation and prayer until he gained an open intercourse with God, a union between God and the soul with nothing material interposed between them. Lopez came to be in the continual presence of God, with the rays of the divinity falling continually on his soul. Once in later life, he received the Eucharist, having declared, I do not remember to have offended God in anything, at which the priest exclaimed, is it possible for a man not to be conscious to himself of even an idle word? And with an elimination of sin came concomitantly a total assurance of salvation, a marvellous confidence. In short, Lopez had seemingly achieved Christian perfection. Wesley was, of course, soon to say more on that subject in print. In the life of Lopez, he chided erroneous Catholic thinking here, resulting from an Old Testament mistranslation. Lopez led the most simple life. He ate very little, living successively on parched corn, milk and cheese, fruit, roots and herbs, and never meat. Wesley could be critical of excessive privations. Lopez slept on the ground with just a stone for a pillow, and Wesley commented tersely, neither are these particular instances of self-denial always necessary for our imitation. But as his spirituality deepened, Lopez avoided the excesses of enthusiasm and mysticism, raptures, wailings, trances, as experienced, for example, by Saint Ignatius and Saint Teresa. Slide, please. Perfection does not exist, he said, in visions, revelations, ravishments, and ecstasies. He never desired to see angels or visions, nor did he flagellate, believing that God would chastise him. As Wesley noted in a letter, that man of God had passed beyond those experiences to a spiritual calm, his close, uninterrupted communion with the deity himself. Slide, please. Lopez's rejection of visions appealed to Wesley's rationality. Given the centrality of the Bible for Wesley and his condemnation of Rome's restriction on its reading, he also approved of Lopez's ardent desire of reading the Holy Scriptures. Indeed, Lopez resolved to learn all the Bible by heart. Those who consulted him about the Scriptures were amazed at his understanding, and he regarded God as his teacher, not religious books. Praiseworthy thinking for Wesley in light of his stress on individual conscience and his rejection of Rome's teaching on tradition. Wesley's stress on providence for nations and individuals was likewise mirrored in Lopez's determination to do whatever the divine majesty should call him to. Lopez, according to Delosa, entirely abandoned himself to the providence of God. He never asked for alms. He interpreted his illnesses as providential interventions and urged others to throw themselves wholly into God's hands. Nonetheless, Wesley rejected Lopez's hermit solitude. Hardly surprisingly, given his own very practical Christianity, his constant contact with others, either in person or by correspondence, and his exhausting evangelizing journeys. Early in the account, describing Lopez seeking for hermitage, he observed in a footnote, "It is absolutely certain that this resolution is not to be justified by Scripture principles." And consequently, Lopez is not to be imitated in this. Convinced that Christian living enjoined active service in society, he could only add rather weakly, however, God might wink at the time's ignorance. He later reinforced this by noting that the uncommon temptations of the devil, which Lopez endured, were the results of hermits going out of their way, the way which God has prescribed. He permits Satan thus to buffet them. And even more textually about the devil's continuing assaults and temptations on Lopez, what wonder while he was out of God's way? Despite these strictures on the hermit life, Lopez sometimes aided others in a manner which was for Wesley thoroughly praiseworthy. As much as he loved solitude, Lopez never shut the door against any who came for spiritual relief or comfort. The learned consulted him about passages of Scripture and were astonished at his knowledge. In his last years, he was perpetually visited by men in authority, ecclesiastics and noblemen seeking his advice. He comforted the sick. He himself endured very poor health, and in addition compiled a book containing simple remedies for most diseases, obviously reminiscent of Wesley's own hugely popular 23 editions by 1791 Primitive Physic. When he had settled, Lopez cultivated a small garden, and what he grew there he gave in charity to those who passed by. He proclaimed his commitment to charity on arriving at Vera Cruz. He gave to the poor all the wealth he had brought from Spain, reserving nothing for himself. Lopez's life then highlighted tensions in Wesley's own thinking. On the one hand, Wesley's great yearning for the fullest communion with God, which inspired almost a jealousy of Lopez. And on the other, his commitment to a very practical ministry. Hence his slightly shifting assessments of Lopez. In 1742, in his journal, "That good and wise, though much mistaken man," and later in 1765, in a letter to John Newton, "Is Thomas à Kempis, Gregory Lopez, gone to hell? Believe it who can. By contrast, this difficulty did not arise from the life of Gaston de Ronty, since de Ronty coupled the most energetic philanthropy with a deep personal piety. As Wesley observed, whilst Monsieur de Ronty was serving the poor, he stated that he was in constant communion with God. In 1758, Wesley even stated that, slide please, the life of de Ronty by the Jesuit Jean-Baptiste Saint-Jour, published in 1651, was his favourite book. He published a version of it in 1741, slide please, and 5 editions were issued before his death. Significantly, the volume is broadly divided into 2, almost equal halves. The first describes de Ronty's spiritual quest, the second his charitable endeavours. Born of a noble family in Normandy, de Ronty was educated at Paris and Caen. As a young man, he read a Kempis's De Imitatio Christi and considered becoming a Carthusian, a detail omitted in Wesley's account, but was dissuaded by his parents and married. 5 children were born to the couple. But at the age of 27, de Ronty began to strive for a perfect consecration to God's service. He withdrew from court and abandoned worldly business. He declined a political role in 1646, displaying his extreme contempt of the world and accounting all its allurements as dung and dross. He died 3 years later, aged only 37. Today, de Ronty is perhaps best known as the promoter of the Company of the Blessed Sacrament, a secret religious society for the period's rich and powerful elite. Yet that did not interest Wesley, though much else did. De Ronty's charitable endeavours were prodigious. One day each week, he visited the sick poor in the Hôpital de Dieu in Paris. On another, the poor in his own parish. On a third, those in prison. He found accommodation and work for the destitute. And during the first Fronde, he bought bread for the poor. In time, he acquired a kind of holy envy towards the poor, among whom Christ himself had lived and died. Through his nationwide correspondence, he advised about works of charity and establishing and organising hospitals. Particular sufferers attracted his concern, such as the English and Irish refugees from the civil wars, those condemned to the galleys, and those enslaved in North Africa. He also took instruction in medicine so that he was able to effect simple cures, though never advancing beyond his knowledge, carrying his surgeon's box when he visited the poor. De Ronty naturally saw charitable works as an opportunity for providing Christian teaching. Thus, from 1641, he invited to dinner each week 3 or 4 men, seeking out such as seemed most to need instruction, and when they were at his house, instructed them in the chief points of Christianity. He also instructed the poor at the Saint-Gervais Hospital. When travelling, he instructed strangers, once showing some labourers in the field how to sanctify the work they were about. Naturally, de Ronty further sought to advise others through correspondence, since our great business is to hear the eternal word. Each morning he read the New Testament bareheaded and on his knees. And of course, he sought to influence others by his own example. One of his close friends observed, one might easily judge, he was always actually in the presence of God. Duranty established evangelizing societies at Amiens and Caen and Dijon and at other places in Burgundy. In these, he expected the members to assist one another in working out both their own and their neighbours' salvation. Interestingly, one of Wesley's family, when reading Wesley's version of Duranty's life, noted in the volume, which is now in the Cambridge University Library, like my Uncle John's Methodist classes. And indeed, Samuel Wesley viewed Duranty's societies as models. Duranty also wanted some tradesmen to live like primitive Christians in common, an ideal which John Wesley was later to espouse, as John Walsh has described in detail. As Bill mentioned, Duranty established such companies as tailors and shoemakers in Paris and one at Toulouse. Their members ate, worked and prayed together and, like a religious order, called each other brothers. As with Gregorio Lopez, Duranty trusted utterly in providence, living wholly in conformity with the will of God. Thus, when visiting Dijon, he suffered a very painful attack of rheumatism, but declared that it was a favour for a soul to suffer for God's will. Sickness gave the sufferer the opportunity to submit resignedly to that will as Christ had suffered on earth. Hence, blessed be the plague, the scourges of God, which produce in us these effects of grace and salvation. This thinking steeled him emotionally. In 1641, one of his children died, but when he was informed, he showed not the least sign of disturbance, his affection to the child yielding to his absolute conformity to the will of God. Humans must appreciate, Duranty stated, that they could not fully understand God's purpose, which might well counter their own immediate wishes. And again, as with Gregorio Lopez, Wesley was captivated by Duranty's walking with God, the continual presence of God, which so wholly took up his spirit. One of Duranty's friends wrote of that immediate union with God. Like Lopez too, Duranty did not experience visions, miracles, revelations, but rather relied solely on a pure and naked faith to carry him to God. But to repeat, Wesley was hugely impressed by the retention of this union, while Duranty was ceaselessly engaged in charitable works in the bust of Paris. Indeed, Duranty himself recognized his blessedness here, telling a close friend, "God of his mercy hath given me the grace to be inseparably with him, even in the crowd of business." How greatly, too, in his packed life, Wesley sought to carry about with him an experimental verity and fullness of the presence of the ever-blessed Trinity. It is not, in conclusion, always easy to read the lives of Lopez and Duranty with proper empathy or indeed sympathy. Once Delosa, whose patience was plainly extraordinary, remarked to Lopez, "See how hard it rains." Then lightning struck Delosa's hand, making it smart exceedingly, only to be told, "You are paid as you deserve for your idle words. Did not I see myself how hard it rained?" Comparably, one day a scaffold on which Duranty stood with his workmen fell down and hurt several of them, but it moved not him. his spirit remained in the same evenness, as if nothing had happened, being settled on him, in whom there is no variableness, neither shadow of turning. Moreover, when reading Duranty's life, Molière's Tartuffe is apt to materialize, which since seemingly the play was in part an attack on the Company of the Blessed Sacrament, is not altogether surprising. Nor in a short paper is it possible to do justice to the various nuances. More could be said about the themes of verbal economy, as with Delosa and the lightning, and the proper use of time, both prized, slide please, by Lopez and Duranty. More could be said too, much more, on Wesley's editing and abridgments of Delosa and Saint-Jeur's lives. The Christian Library's format of extracts and abridgments was highly useful to Wesley, and his edition of Duranty's life was only an extract. A consummate and ferocious abridger, it is a small wonder Mr. Wesley did not abridge the Gospel according to St. John, a Victorian Methodist remarked. Abridgments permitted him to excise from Catholic works passages which contradicted Protestant doctrine or jarred with Protestant sensibilities, as Edmund Duffy has demonstrated. Given the audience too, I have avoided, with due verbal economy, laboriously stressing each obvious parallel between Wesley's theology and practice and the theology and practice of Lopez and Duranty. Nevertheless, I hope that I've substantiated the huge worth of these Catholic might-have-been monks in John Wesley's eyes, and especially that of Duranty, to whose example, as John Walsh has shown, Wesley owed so much when considering the poor and its needs. On the title page of his life, Wesley added a text not in Saint-Jeur's work, which epitomized his admiration. James 2:22, seest thou how faith wrought together with his works, and by works was faith made perfect. Thank you very much.